to be quiet for like 20 minutes. Oh. Hi. Okay, Pathwork, guide lecture number 5. I'm going to motor through this. My glasses are dirty. 1 second. What is truth, freedom, justice, religion, happiness as a link in the chain of life? Greetings. I bring you God's blessings. My dear ones, God's spirit world would want nothing more than to help you grow spiritually into happiness, harmony, and enlightenment. And God's spirits try continually to stretch out their hands to man to make him pass the grade where he is just encountering difficulty, struggling in his development on the path to perfection. But we can only help, not enforce it. First, man has to make up his mind and open the door with a perpetual desire. Then he will feel this help as a palpable reality. This, in turn, will tremendously increase the feelings of walking on safe ground and deepen his trust in the reality and truthfulness of God's spirit world. But man hardly sees, hears, feels that God's spirit helpers are around him. But man hardly sees, hears, feels that God's spirit helpers are around him, offering a helping hand because he pays no attention. Even if in principle he believes in the existence of God and his hand, even in principle he believes in the existence of God and his spirit world, he does not think that his belief or unbelief make a difference, affecting his life and its problems on a personal level. That's really complicated, that sentence. I'm not sure it's great. Even if, in principle, he believes in the existence of God and his spirit world, he does not think that his belief or unbelief make a difference, affecting his life and its problems on a personal level. I fixed it. He just closes the door and thus may switch again to the wrong direction, which is often triggered by a minute detail. But the more he moves away from this central focus, the deeper he runs into a dark alley, and he will have a most difficult time to get out of it again. Although he loves God and wants the good, he frequently can't find the core of that which would have to be realized in order to make progress and find fulfillment. And it may seem an unimportant detail, but in reality, it is the root of a complexity of unhealthy currents in his soul. He does not realize because he does not awaken the faculty, does not want to accept the impressions given by God's spirit world. He rather remains in the old trodden pattern, which seems more convenient. The result is sadness and dissatisfaction with life as such. He does not know why, but my dear ones, this rejection of divine help is frequently the reason. It is my task to give you hints through my words to awaken you. May each of you hear what applies individually, but even for this, you have to have the desire. And only then can you digest beneficially this material within. Whenever you have staked out your goal, consciously or just emotionally, and this goal is a selfish one, you may not be able to reach what you want. And even if you reach it, it will be of a fleeting effect and satisfaction. Its climax will be dry and shallow and quickly dispersed. And if you want the outer happiness, you will never be happy. Of course, you will say, I don't want this selfish happiness. I will be glad to see others happy. But there is quite a difference whether this is just a general thought, maybe a duty-bound wish superficially uttered once in a while, or it's a true desire that penetrates the whole being. Try to search yourself in order to find out the depth of this desire in you. Here, too, you may deceive yourself. The mind wants it because you know this or that recipe for happiness, but another part of the personality, which I call the lower self, the emotions into a completely different direction. The feeling, let me read that again because that was a little bit weird. Try to search yourself in order to find out the depth of this desire in you. Here too, you may deceive yourself. The mind wants it because you know this or that recipe for happiness, but another part of the personality, which I call the lower self, pulls the emotion into a completely different direction. This feeling is not so very much concerned with the neighbor, even if by human gestures you wish the best for your neighbor, at least as far as no personal sacrifice or great effort is involved. And there you have the point of vexation. Of course, most human beings, unless on a very low level, will in principle be glad if the others are well. And here even a more developed human being may, when meditating this question with honest scrutiny, detect occasional envy and a slightly malicious joy when misfortune hits another. But who is willing to sacrifice the least bit for anybody else? Ask yourself, do I want the happiness because I want to be happy? Or is it a secondary necessity? Meditate on this. Approach God and say, naturally I cannot feel thee, dear Lord. I want to be happy, but to maintain this happiness, I want to be a link. What you give me, I want to convey to others in some shape or form, even if I have to make a sacrifice, perhaps the sacrifice of some ego desire. Please show me how I may convert that which you give me into something I can relate to others. If you absorb this thought until it has taken root in the soul, until it becomes a spiritual form, penetrating the emotions wholly and entirely, then man will have met the conditions, and the spiritual law involved will take beneficial effect, which will be true inner happiness, because man himself is no longer the target, and his selfish happiness no longer the ultimate goal. So in this way, the wisdom and knowledge the I has acquired is released into the happiness of the you. Giving, sharing to make others happy, to make other ones happy, and thus his own happiness is, so to speak, an interpolative nature. It is giving to him, and he successively conveys it to others. He is a living adapter. His only need to keep the flux of happiness alive. Thus man will never go stale. A human being who functions as such an adapter will receive in return 100-fold measure what he gives. God will always show you how, in which form you may give out, but you must be willing to do so. And as a matter of fact, you have to decide for this willingness today, tomorrow, and next week, and every day. You have to overcome resistance, and you have to act upon this willingness consciously, not pushing it into the unconscious maybe deed. Action counts here, especially so that God may show you more precisely the way, and the law can slowly be set in motion. Think about the good you receive. Your health, one's health returns. Another one's spiritual strength increases tremendously. A third one finds a happy relationship, or another such evidential happening. You all receive special treasures from God, and once you decide, I don't want to be the ultimate goal. I want to serve as an adapter. You will be shown how you can convey what you have received. On the other hand, you will consequently receive more and more, because that is the law. At the same time, you will not take your gifts and treasures for granted, which in itself is a sign of spiritual shallowness. The gift has lost aliveness because one link in the chain is missing, giving. You violated the law of chain reaction. Contemplate your treasures. Then you will revitalize them, and they will bring you joy and pleasure, which you had never realized or had lost. And as with happiness in general, so it is with all the other desires, love, strength, health, and freedom. Whatever is desired for self-indulgence will dissolve or wither. But what is desired to give to others will sprout and multiply for the giver and for the receiver. There are so many human beings who want to remain free, and they shy away from everything that might bind them. But here too, the law takes effect. If you want freedom for selfish reasons, you will remain chained inside. And if you desire freedom to serve in a special way as an adapter for God and his plan of salvation, in order to help others develop more profoundly and rapidly, you will receive the gift of freedom without being bound inside. Yes, then you will not only be free in outer circumstances, but also within. So if man presumptively craves for freedom from God in that he does not want to abide by his laws, such craving will turn into bondage, captivity, and utter confinement of the soul. But if man draws closer to God and his laws, his freedom and independence will truly increase. And this is the immutable law which man cannot overthrow. And these laws are born of wisdom and love. And if man, in defiance and ignorance, revolts against them, regardless of whether man cannot comprehend them fully or for some unhealthy emotional reasons, the result invariably will be a growing inner bondage. So many rebel against a seemingly unjust distribution of destiny to man. They cannot comprehend that God is just that. They cannot comprehend that God is just and that in the spiritual realm, infallible justice rules. God's justice uses human injustice in order to become operable. So, my dear ones, this may appear to some of you as a contradiction, but this is not the case. The equation always equalizes, and I will explain by giving you some examples of how you should see this. Take, for instance, a criminal who has committed a number of crimes who is acquitted every time. He laughs sardonically, not only about man's stupidity, but also about the injustice, which in his case, due to his machinations, was to his advantage. But one day, he is accused of and imprisoned for a crime which he did not commit. Then he will scream about how unjust the world is. You see, he was acquitted of crimes previously which he did commit. Then he was convicted, forced to pay for a crime he did not commit. The more obstinate a human being is, the less he will comprehend the great justice that is behind the seeming minor injustice, because he does not want to see it. Let me read that again. The more obstinate a human being is, the less he will comprehend the great justice that is behind the seeming minor injustice, because he does not want to see it. And this is the test, because if man's justice would be equal to God's justice, it would be too effortless for man to recognize God's justice and all that is interwoven in it. A being's self-induced imperfection must serve as a remedy, and if I may say so, to strive for recovery of lost perfection. So if there would be perfect justice on earth, impossible, though, since imperfection was the choice of free will and thus has to be overcome by free will decision, then it would be too easy for man. It would be no test, and it would also be too little or no challenge at all to strive for higher recognition. Such higher recognition is utmost grace. But man has to open the door himself, and this is contained in the test: to will advancement, even if it means to give up stubbornness, defiance, and sophism. It is God's magnitude and glory that he uses imperfection to open the way to perfection. That divine justice makes use of human injustice. So my example is an extreme one, but it applies to all of you in some shape or form. Search in this direction and you will recognize it, although it is not easy to meet the self-honesty. Sometimes you may have to pay for something you did not do. Yet actually the bill was not presented for past misdeeds. Only in meditation and firmly determined will you be able to find this out. Even if you did something in a past life for which you have to pay now, in your meditation you may realize it. Of course, assuming that you walk on the path of purification. This I can promise each one of you. Some of my friends have already experienced this, and it has helped them in their present life to understand the background. Now it is easier for them to fulfill tasks and to pay debts. Such realizations are heaven's thanks for the honest effort man makes, for his humility and his goodwill. Of course, sometimes man is not required to pay instantly for the little misdeeds because the spirit world expects that. Let me read it again. Such realizations are heaven's thanks for the honest effort man makes, for his humility and his goodwill. Of course, sometimes man is not required to pay instantly for the little misdeeds because the spirit world expects that in his self-search, a man will detect character faults in his meditation. But if he does not search in this direction, the effect of the little misdeeds suddenly swoops down upon him so that he, mind you, can detect his wrong currents better and realize what inside and outside needs changing. And this also contains a test as to how man takes a heavy downpour, what attitude he takes. Does he say, I am not that bad that I would deserve all this? Or will he reason that God is justice and that something must be wrong within him. That is the question, and reasoning what is wrong within leads to passing the test and contains the reorientation required for the path of development. So it is a special grace, and I choose this word purposely. If man can pay off in this life and not in the next, because it is so much easier to see the connecting thread and thus realize the ultimate justice, even though in roundabout ways. Last but not least, this will establish safe ground and permanent trust in God. However, even if you pay off debts from past lives, you will be granted the grace of recognition if you open the door by an entirely voluntary decision to recognize self and purify the soul. And then you will have less difficulty to harmonize your relationship with God, which actually constitutes man's happiness. It is not the other way around, as often assumed. And I tell you this in order to make you think about your difficulties and whether they stem from past or present life misdeeds. Whatever it is, each one of you will have the opportunity to find the root within himself, which is the responsible factor for the burden, this certain fault. The essential part is that it is recognized and treated. Absorb my viewpoint and approach your problems accordingly. When man sheds the human shell and re-enters the realm of spirit, most of that which you call the sub and unconscious is accessible. None of you, my dear ones, even those who are more advanced in this work, including the ones whose soul is in the healing process, none of you, my dear ones, even those of you more advanced in this work, including the ones whose soul is in the healing process, have even a remote concept of the reality of the unconscious, which seems so divided and often operates contrary to the conscious. Some of you who are in the healing process have already an inkling. And when you hit upon some of these unconscious currents and tendencies, it requires some work, discipline, and training to become sensitized to these currents. And it appears to you that you are dealing with a stranger who leads a life unknown to you. When you have reached that point where the self and unconscious is accessible, sing, glory, hallelujah. The first battle is won. Let me read that again. When you have reached the point where the self and unconscious is accessible, sing glory, hallelujah. The first battle is won. The first step towards unification of personality is accomplished. Don't get depressed. It is so utterly important for those who strive for utmost self-recognition to face their sub and unconscious now, because this unknown is a mighty force as long as it is not yet in man's consciousness. And this unconscious is such a tremendous power because of its underhandedness, resulting in widespread symptoms. These undercurrents cannot be controlled as long as man is not aware of them. It is a wrong conclusion that the effects are less disturbing as long as man is not aware of the undercurrent. Of course, man may be able to control the outer effects, the crises, the conflict, but that does not suffice. And you know by now that all thoughts and feelings are forms of greatest reality, even if you cannot see them. These forms are a far-reaching effect that move in circles, causes consequences and reactions, which in turn haul along their own consequences, altogether resulting in a long chain reaction. That is really complicated, and let me read that again. When you have reached that point where the self and unconscious is accessible, sing glory, hallelujah. The first battle is won. The first step towards unification of personality is accomplished. Don't get depressed. It is so utterly important for those who strive for utmost self-recognition to face their sub and unconscious now, because this unknown is a mighty force as long as it is not yet in man's consciousness. And this unconscious is such a tremendous power because of its underhandedness, resulting in widespread symptoms. And these undercurrents cannot be controlled as long as man is not aware of them. And it is a wrong conclusion that the effects are less disturbing as long as man is not aware of the undercurrent. Of course, man may not be able to control the outer effects, the crises, the conflict, but man may be able to control the outer effects, the crises, the conflict, but that does not suffice. And you know by now that all thoughts and feelings are forms of greatest reality, even if you cannot see them. These forms are of far-reaching effect that moves in circles and causes consequences and reactions, which in turn haul along their own consequences, altogether resulting in a long chain reaction. Man may be able to control the more recent chain reactions when they manifest in outer events, but, as said before, this is not enough because the shifting of soul force can only then take place when he penetrates to the core in the unconscious. Thus you will find that man wants the good and the right actions mentally, and also his higher self, another part of the unconscious, agrees. But one part in man is ruled by destructive and wrong intentions of not necessarily criminal. That depends on the state of development. But by comparison, the bad characteristics of a well-developed person are of equal weight as a criminal tendency and a being on a low level. I'm going to read that again because this is pretty timely for what we're going through in America right now. Thus you will find that man wants the good and the right actions mentally. Also, his higher self, another part of the unconscious, agrees. But another part in man is ruled by destructive and wrong intentions, not necessarily criminal. That depends on the state of development. But by comparison, the bad characteristics of a well-developed person are of equal weight as a criminal tendency in a being on a low level. And this other part wants also the blindness, the impossible, and chafes the soul by requesting fulfillment of such impossible desires, which partly cannot be realized per se, partly because the higher self in man strives for something better. So these clashing tendencies exhaust the soul, and they sometimes make man ill, but always cause inner disharmony in one area or another. But most of all, they prevent the spiritual development of the advanced degree. Therefore, my dear ones, I urge you to direct all of your attention to this in meditation, in prayer, in your efforts. Get acquainted with your unconscious. Bring it to your awareness. Without such recognition, there can be no progress that counts. Without it, you will see these tendencies openly when the soul returns to the spirit realm, and it will be harder to battle then. To face self often means disappointment because man believes he is much further advanced in his development until he meets his ugly self. He thinks only that counts which he has done, but emotions also do. And they cause as much effect as our outer actions. And it is incomparably more difficult and takes much longer to affect development of the soul, personality in the spirit world than while on earth. Let me just read that again because that's pretty valuable. It is incomparably more difficult and takes much longer to affect development of the soul, personality in the spirit world than while on earth. Therefore, God has created earth as it is. And only with the imperfection that surrounds you, with all the differences in development that exist on earth, can soul growth take place rapidly to give you a chance of quicker advancement. But sometimes it needs more incarnations to rectify the imperfect, blind, unconscious currents. And if you would will purification more fervently, you could spare yourself such burdened earth lives. The fact that man's development has advanced to such an extent that at least a certain number of human beings are ready to realize inner currents means that in your days, many more human beings have matured enough to undergo inner search. Therefore, some pioneers incarnated to lay the cornerstone, relating some knowledge about the soul, the unconscious, and God, pushing, even though humanity knows just a minor part of it. More and more will be revealed. Of course, not all people are ready. Many have yet to learn how to act in congruity with God's laws. They will not find the path of purification, but it is never accidental if man experiences guidance. Many human beings find the way to the human soul doctor, but they only go when their inner conflicts have taken on such dimensions that they are torn apart, totally unhappy, and can't find their way any longer. However, those who are on a higher level already, or at least want to be there, should take the path of soul search without being in a major crisis, and absolutely voluntarily, in the recognition that it cannot be avoided. What is difficult on earth will be more difficult in the spirit world, and it will take much more time. And the earlier you start, the easier it will be. And so don't try to persuade yourself that what I say may not be true, and that then you may have taken all the trouble connected with the path of soul healing upon yourself in vain. No, my dear ones, nothing that man achieves spiritually is ever in vain. These are the only lasting values that will never disperse. They will be yours eternally. And the more you postpone the purification of the soul, the more unhealthy currents will cluster in the and subconscious, and the more difficult it will get to disentangle them. Because as long as you don't get acquainted with the unconscious currents in your consciousness, you will, let me just read that again. Because as long as you don't get acquainted with the unconscious currents in your consciousness, you will daily, even hourly, push back and cover these resulting emotional reactions in the unconscious, piling continuously new upon old ones. Contemplate this carefully. Free yourself from all resistances, which you quite certainly will encounter, at least in the beginning, and let them not be sugar-coated. These resistances offer nice explanations and deviations for the intellect, but in reality, they are subterfuges to avoid the self-search. Observe all this critically. The subterfuges which appear quickly to hush the mind, even dismissal of the whole problem. Observe your reactions when you read these words and what you feel after you have contemplated them. Do you have an unpleasant feeling, hidden, or quite clearly so? Do you want to shrug it off with the thought that you don't need it? Search yourself, my dear ones. Whoever is truly willing and decides to purify his soul will have the possibility to do so, because once you have made the decision, the helping hand will be there. Even though the healing of the soul of which I speak here must and should not proceed in the same way for each individual, there will be that way for each one of you which is suitable and appropriate to his needs. The same way is not the best for everybody. Now, I want to switch to a subject which has been discussed at some occasions and which seems to puzzle some of you. How and why is it possible that there are so many different concepts in the field of religions on earth, and you think everybody says something different, contradictory to some extent? Thus, none can be the truth. There is only one truth, my dear ones, and the difference in human concepts should be pictured in the following way, excluding errors that may have been handed down from old times. As everything of spirit has form and gestalt, so does the true facts. So this form is unchangeable and yet in constant flux, since everything of spirit is moving continuously, vibrating in circular rotation. There is no standstill, no feeling, nothing is stagnant. Imagine a wheel, which on the whole is unchangeable, but it moves constantly. Men at their various locations and times lift now and then the veil that hides the wheel, and they see a minute part of the huge wheel behind the veil. Man sees this little detail of the wheel at certain times. Another human being sees something else at another time and location. Whatever they may have seen may or may not agree, because the wheel is moving, and whoever lifts the veil may see just then something different. And when they relate what they have seen, it may appear to be contradictory, because the connecting lines of the whole cannot be seen due to the veil. If the whole wheel would be uncovered, that which seems contradictory would become whole. There is humanity fighting, because the various concepts sound like contradictions, while in reality it is not so. Even distinct errors contain somewhere a grain of truth when you search for the core of deduction. Someday, and when there is an opportunity, I will show you what is meant. Man approaches this whole area with the wrong attitude. He thinks frequently that the absolute truth cannot exist, only relative truth, based on the various concepts derived from the views behind the veil. Thus he purports that everything connected with God and creation is more or less a matter of personal opinion or taste. Each belief has its good and its beauty, he says, and therefore all these questions are subjective, not absolute or objective ones. The emotional result is that absolute spiritual truth does not exist. He does not search for the truth that can be found in each religious concept, but puts it aside, perhaps only emotionally, as illusion, imagination, or human preference. Thus he inactivates the absolute within himself, which exists only in the spiritual. And if man presumptuously draws such conclusion about God and human error, he excludes the recognition of his own truth quite considerably, and he will hardly ever be able to take a glimpse behind this veil. The basic truth, The basis for self-search includes man's recognition that there is absolute truth beyond. Let me read that again. The basis for self-search includes man's recognition that there is absolute truth beyond human relative truth, and that if he transfers human relative truth to the spiritual truth, thinking it is also relative while it is absolute, he shuts the door to self-realization. And you may say there are two groups of human beings, one which follows blindly, given dogmas without thinking about them. They will never have the deep personal experience of recognizing the truth. And the other extreme group is the one I mentioned above. In your days, many belong to this group, especially among the intellectuals. They find their views particularly objective, and they have freed themselves, so they say, from